In the shadowed corners of antebellum America, where cotton kings reigned supreme and secrets festered like untreated wounds, one tale defies the grave. Unearthed from forgotten ledgers and yellowed journals, it's a saga of vengeance so meticulously cruel it poisoned the soil it sprang from. Imagine a grand estate, its columns gleaming under magnolia blooms, hiding a rot that no sermon could absolve. A family's honor, built on broken backs, crumbles under the gaze of one man who saw too much and struck back with silence sharper than any blade. Welcome to Hollow Truths, where we drag the unspeakable into the light. Tonight, we descend into Willowbrook Plantation, Madison County, Georgia, fall of 1857. Brace yourself, this isn't just history. It's a mirror to the abyss. Among the fragmented archives of Madison County, Georgia, a story of the most macabre revenge in the slaveholding South lies dormant, preserved not in official histories, but in the water-damaged pages of a private diary. This document, the personal journal of a traveling Episcopal missionary named Reverend Elias Hawthorne, begins in the autumn of 1857. It speaks of a land of stark contrasts where immense cotton wealth was built upon a foundation of absolute human degradation, a system upheld by a rigid code of public honor and fervent performative piety. The diary serves as the primary lens through which this terrible family story unfolds, a record of a moral collapse so complete it was nearly erased from memory. The narrative introduces the Reverend's most prominent patrons, the Beaumont family, masters of the prosperous Willowbrook Plantation. He describes Elias Beaumont as a man of formidable public standing, his authority unquestioned in both the courthouse and the church. His wife Eliza is depicted as a woman of celebrated Southern beauty whose grace was the subject of local admiration. Living under the same roof was Elias's unmarried sister, Lydia Beaumont, a figure of austere and severe religiosity whose presence seemed a constant silent judgment upon the household's more worldly affairs. These figures form the triad at the center of this sinister tale. Hawthorne's initial entries are filled with a cautious admiration for the Beaumont's social position and their generous contributions to his fledgling parish. He notes the immaculate order of the plantation, the discipline of the enslaved workforce, and the veneer of Christian charity that coated every public interaction. Yet, even in these early passages, a profound sense of disquiet permeates his writing. He records an observation of the Grand Beaumont Manor, a place where grace was spoken of with great ceremony, yet where the very structure seemed to hold a deep and contrary silence, an emptiness that no amount of prayer or social gathering could ever truly fill. This feeling of a spiritual void is a recurring theme in the Reverend's first months at Willowbrook. He writes of the perfectly arranged rooms, the polished silver, and the portraits of Beaumont ancestors, staring down with expressions of immutable pride. But he also describes this perfection as sterile, a meticulously constructed facade designed to conceal something hollow at its core. It was a house, he noted, built to be seen, not to be lived in, a stage for the performance of honor, where the true life of its inhabitants remained a carefully guarded, hidden secret. The local community, as described in Hawthorne's letters to his diocese in Philadelphia, viewed the Beaumonts as pillars of their society. Elias Beaumont's word was law, and Eliza's social leadership was undisputed. Any rumor of discord or unhappiness within their home was dismissed as the idle gossip of the envious. This public perception was the family's greatest defense, an armor of respectability so thick that it rendered them immune to scrutiny. The Reverend himself admits to initially accepting this public narrative, viewing his own unease as the product of a northern sensibility unaccustomed to the peculiar institutions of the South. However, the diary reveals that this acceptance was short-lived. A late autumn entry contains a single chilling sentence that signals a shift in his perception. After attending a Sunday dinner at the manor, he writes, "Today I saw the true machinery of this household, and it is not powered by cotton or by commerce, but by a quiet foundational cruelty that has the texture of an ancient sin." This marks the end of his admiration, and the beginning of his role as an unwilling chronicler of a brewing unspeakable crime. The world of Willowbrook Plantation in 1858 was on its surface a paragon of Southern order. But beneath this placid exterior, forces were at work that would lead to its utter annihilation. The Reverend's journal becomes the only surviving testament to the internal rot that was consuming the Beaumont family from within. Long before any external agent of chaos made his presence known, the stage was set, the characters were in place, and the house itself seemed to be waiting for the final act of a tragedy written in its very foundations. The initial promise of a respectable parish posting had for Reverend Hawthorne soured into something far more foreboding. He found himself a witness to a pathology he could not name, a spiritual sickness that defied the simple Christian dichotomies of good and evil. He was a man of God in a place where faith was just another commodity, another tool for the maintenance of a brutal and unholy order. His writings from this period are filled with a sense of dread, as if he knew he was standing on the precipice of a revelation that would shatter not only one family, but his own understanding of divine justice. What was the nature of this foundational cruelty that the Reverend observed? The answer would not be found in the plantation's public records, nor in the ledgers detailing crop yields and profits. It resided in the silent, unrecorded spaces of the Beaumont manor, in the glances, gestures, and duties of a single, enigmatic figure whose existence was about to bring the entire edifice of lies crashing down. The mystery of Willowbrook Plantation was not a question of what was visible, but of what was deliberately and violently kept unseen. The first documented anomaly appears in a diary entry from the winter of 1857, where Reverend Hawthorne records his first meaningful observation of an enslaved man known only as Solomon. This was not a man he had seen in the cotton fields or among the laborers mending fences, but one who existed entirely within the domestic sphere of the main house. Hawthorne's description is notable for what it lacks. He does not mention the man's physical strength or signs of toil, but focuses instead on an unnatural stillness, a profound and unsettling composure that seemed entirely out of place for a person of his station. Solomon's duties, as Hawthorne observed, were perfunctory and intimate. He served meals, tended to the fire in the drawing-room, and assisted Eliza with her cloak. Yet he performed these tasks with a detached, almost clinical precision. The Reverend's writing struggles to capture the source of his unease, finally settling on Solomon's gaze. It was not the downcast, subservient look of the other house slaves, nor was it defiant. It was, Hawthorne writes, intensely and unnervingly observant, as if he were not a servant in the room, but a physician studying a disease. Initially, the Reverend attempts to rationalize this impression. He speculates that Solomon must possess a rare intelligence, and that his silent watchfulness is simply the mark of a keen mind trapped in bondage. He even considers speaking to Elias Beaumont about the man, perhaps suggesting he be given work more suited to his apparent intellect, but he refrains, held back by a sense of caution he cannot articulate. His diary entry concludes with a line that reveals the depth of his disquiet. To see him is to feel oneself being inventoried, to have one's own moral ledger silently and accurately assessed. This encounter plants a seed of doubt in Hawthorne's mind about the true power dynamics within the Beaumont household. While Elias Beaumont was the undisputed master in the eyes of the world, and Eliza the commanding mistress, Solomon's presence introduced a third silent element that seemed to subtly subvert that order. His obedience was absolute. Yet it felt like a performance, a strategic compliance that masked a deeper, unreadable purpose. The man was a living paradox, a powerless figure who emanated a strange and palpable authority. The anomaly of Solomon's existence was heightened by his isolation. Hawthorne notes that he rarely saw him interact with the other enslaved people. He moved through the house like a specter, his world confined to the grand oppressive rooms of the manor, his reality defined entirely by his proximity to his masters. This separation marked him as different, setting him apart in a way that was both a privilege and a curse. He was an object of the family's private world, a secret kept within the walls of the house, and this secrecy was the source of his unsettling power. The Reverend's later entries from this period return to Solomon again and again, as if he were a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. He describes Solomon standing perfectly still in a darkened hallway for long minutes, or watching the reflection of the family in a polished mirror rather than looking at them directly. These were small, easily dismissed behaviors, yet they accumulated in Hawthorne's mind, forming a pattern of deliberate, intelligent observation that felt entirely at odds with the man's supposed role as a simple domestic servant. The other members of the Beaumont family seemed oblivious to, or perhaps complicit in, this strange dynamic. Elias Beaumont treated Solomon with the same casual disregard he showed all his property. Eliza's interactions were more complex, a mixture of imperious commands and a strange, almost proprietary attention. Lydia Beaumont, the pious sister, was the only one who seemed to share Hawthorne's unease, her eyes often following Solomon with a look of intense suspicion and spiritual revulsion, as if she sensed in him the presence of a corrupting influence. This first documented anomaly, then, was not an event, but a presence. It was the introduction of a character who did not fit the established narrative of the slaveholding South. Solomon was not a rebellious body to be broken, nor a compliant tool to be used. He was a silent, calculating mind, and his quiet study of his captors felt to Hawthorne like the prelude to a judgment. The question that hangs over the Reverend's writing is not what Solomon might do, but what he already knows. The mystery of his observant gaze would soon find its context in a series of escalating domestic rituals that were far more disturbing than any act of physical defiance. The disease that Solomon was studying was the moral sickness of the Beaumont family itself, a sickness for which he was not just the primary witness, but was about to become the unwilling instrument of its most devastating symptom. What power did this man hold who could unmake a family with only his silence? Over the following months, Reverend Hawthorne's journal becomes a catalog of anomalous evidence, documenting a series of domestic scenes that reveal the deeply perverse pathology at the heart of the Beaumont family. These were not overt acts of violence, but subtle ritualized moments of degradation that seemed to serve a purpose beyond simple mastery. The entries from this period are marked by a growing sense of horror as the Reverend realizes he is witnessing a form of abuse that is psychological, intimate, and designed to annihilate the soul rather than merely punish the body. A key passage describes an incident in the main parlor. Eliza, in the presence of her sister Lydia and Reverend Hawthorne, accidentally dropped her lace handkerchief. She then commanded Solomon to retrieve it, not with a simple command, but with a languid gesture toward the floor. Solomon knelt, but as he reached for it, she subtly shifted her slippered foot, trapping a corner of the fabric. The act forced him to remain in a position of supplication for a prolonged, deeply uncomfortable moment, his face just inches from her shoe until she finally released it with a satisfied smile. Hawthorne's record of this event is filled with spiritual revulsion. He writes it was a prayer in reverse, an act of devotion to degradation. She was not merely commanding his obedience. She was consuming his dignity as a form of sustenance for her own vanity. He notes that Lydia Beaumont watched the entire exchange with a look of barely concealed fury, her knuckles white as she gripped the Bible in her lap. It was a silent, vicious power play between the two sisters, with Solomon's humiliation as the currency of their unspoken conflict. This pattern of ritualized cruelty escalated. Another entry details how Eliza would insist that Solomon be the one to help her with her riding boots, a task that required a level of physical proximity that was both necessary and deeply inappropriate. She would complain about the fit, forcing him to pull and strain his hands on her ankles, while she looked down at him with an expression that Hawthorne could only describe as a kind of cruel ownership. These were calculated performances designed to reinforce her absolute power over his body in the most intimate of ways. Elias Beaumont, the patriarch, remained willfully blind to this sinister domestic theater. His concerns were external, cotton prices, land disputes, and the preservation of his public honor. Hawthorne writes that Elias saw Solomon as nothing more than a piece of finely tuned machinery, and as long as the machine functioned smoothly, he had no interest in its internal workings. This deliberate ignorance created a vacuum within the house, a private domain where Eliza's perverse whims could be indulged without consequence, and where Lydia's resentful piety could fester and grow. The accumulation of this evidence paints a terrifying portrait of a family consumed by its own pathologies. Eliza's vanity and cruelty, Lydia's jealousy and sanctimony, and Elias' pride and negligence all fed into one another, creating a closed system of psychological torment. Solomon was trapped at the center of the system, not merely a victim of it, but an essential component. He was the object upon which their sins were projected, the silent vessel that contained all the unholy secrets of the Beaumont family. Hawthorne's writings express a growing sense of helplessness. As a man of the cloth, he felt a duty to intervene, to speak out against the moral decay he was witnessing. Yet he was also a guest in their home, a dependent on their patronage, and a northerner in a society deeply hostile to outside judgment. To accuse the Beaumonts would be to invite his own ruin. This conflict paralyzes him, turning his diary into a confessional where he documents the sins he's too afraid to condemn aloud. The evidence points to a form of bondage that transcended the physical. Eliza was not just Solomon's mistress. She had made him a central figure in the psychodrama of her own life, a life defined by a loveless marriage and a bitter rivalry with her sister. His degradation was her source of power, his humiliation a balm for her own secret miseries. And through it all, Solomon endured, his observant, unreadable gaze taking in every detail of this slow, methodical process of damnation. The question that emerges from this accumulation of evidence is no longer just about Solomon's strange composure. It is about his endurance. How could any man withstand such a relentless assault on his humanity without breaking? Hawthorne's journal provides no answer, but it offers a chilling premonition. He begins to suspect that Solomon is not merely enduring, but absorbing, learning, and waiting. The house was a classroom of cruelty, and Solomon was becoming its most dedicated student. By the spring of 1858, the weight of his accumulated observations forces Reverend Hawthorne to formulate his first terrifying hypothesis regarding the true nature of the events at Willowbrook Plantation. In a frantic, ink-blotted entry written late at night by the light of a single candle, he moves beyond simple descriptions of cruelty and attempts to construct a theological and psychological framework for the horror he has witnessed. This passage, recorded in his private journal, represents his attempt to connect the disparate, disturbing dots into a coherent and damning picture of a household's spiritual collapse. His theory centers on Eliza Beaumont. He no longer sees her actions as mere vanity or casual sadism, but as a deliberate and systematic spiritual crime. He writes, "It is not that she commands him, but that she uses him. She has made of his soul a secret mirror, an object in which she forces a reflection of her own absolute power. This is a sin for which I believe there is no redemption, for it is a violation of a soul created in God's image." He hypothesizes that she is not merely asserting her dominance as a mistress, but is engaging in a perverse form of idolatry with her own power as the false god. This hypothesis recasts Solomon not just as a victim, but as a participant in a dark, unwilling sacrament. The rituals of degradation, the handkerchief, the boots, the prolonged and charged moments of proximity were, in Hawthorne's view, the liturgy of this profane religion. Eliza was the high priestess, and Solomon was the living sacrifice, his humanity offered up daily to appease her insatiable ego. This explains for Hawthorne the almost religious intensity of the scenes he has witnessed and the palpable sense of transgression that hangs in the air. This formulation of the problem also provides a context for Lydia Beaumont's behavior. Her obsessive, judgmental piety is reinterpreted not as a righteous opposition to sin, but as a manifestation of profound spiritual jealousy. Hawthorne theorizes that Lydia resents her sister not just for her beauty or her marriage, but for her audacity in creating this private, powerful world of control. She sees her sister's sin, he writes, and mistakes her own envy for piety. She does not wish to save Eliza's soul, but to usurp her power to be the one who stands in judgment. This first hypothesis is a profound turning point in the Reverend's understanding. It moves the story beyond the social injustice of slavery into the realm of a deeply personal spiritual war being waged within the walls of the Beaumont Manor. The plantation is no longer just a place of labor, but a battleground for souls, and the combatants are two sisters locked in a struggle for spiritual dominance with Solomon as the contested territory. Elias Beaumont, the patriarch, is reduced in this theory to a non-entity, a hollow king ruling over a rotten kingdom he refuses to inspect. The partial revelation contained in this hypothesis is a moment of terrible clarity for Hawthorne. It explains the unnatural silence of the house, the sterile perfection of its rooms, and the ever-present sense of dread. He concludes that the house is not haunted by ghosts of the past, but by the living sins of its occupants. The spiritual emptiness he first sensed is the vacuum left by the absence of genuine faith, an absence filled by the dark energies of pride, envy, and a lust for absolute control over another human being. The psychological and moral weight of this conclusion is immense. Hawthorne, as a man of God, is now confronted with a horror that his faith has not prepared him for. This is not the simple, understandable sin of greed or anger, but a complex, calculated desecration of the human spirit. His diary entries from this period become more desperate, filled with prayers for guidance and expressions of his own fear and inadequacy in the face of such a profound and elegant evil. This hypothesis, however, is incomplete. While it provides a powerful explanation for the actions of the Beaumont family, it fails to fully account for the central anomaly, Solomon himself. If he is merely a passive victim, a mere reflector of the sins of others, then his observant, intelligent gaze makes no sense. Hawthorne's theory frames him as the object of the conflict, but the Reverend cannot shake the feeling that he is also somehow its ultimate arbiter. The terror of this first hypothesis is not that it explains everything, but that it reveals the sheer scale of the moral corruption at play. It confirms that the rot runs deeper than he could have ever imagined. The events to come would prove that this spiritual sickness was not contained within the family, but was about to become contagious, and Solomon, the silent mirror, was about to begin reflecting their sins back upon them with a terrifying and righteous clarity. The narrative now shifts from the private internal horror of the Beaumont household to the beginning of its public unraveling, an event meticulously orchestrated by Solomon. Reverend Hawthorne's diary entries record the first incident in the summer of 1858, a calculated moment of exposure that represents the first shot in Solomon's war of psychological revenge. The fracture begins not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastatingly ambiguous scene that shatters the family's carefully constructed public image. According to Hawthorne's account, Elias Beaumont returned home from a trip to Macon earlier than expected. He entered the house to find his wife, Eliza, in her private sitting room, a space normally off-limits to all but her most intimate acquaintances. Solomon was with her. They were not engaged in any overt act of impropriety, but the scene was damning in its intimacy. Eliza was standing close to Solomon, her hand on his shoulder as she adjusted the collar of his shirt. It was a gesture one might show a child or a lover, but never an enslaved man. The effect of this discovery was explosive, but not in the way one might expect. Elias Beaumont's reaction was not the immediate violent rage of a jealous husband. Instead, Hawthorne describes a chilling public performance of denial. He did not confront his wife or Solomon in the room. He simply turned, walked back out to the veranda, and called for the overseer in a voice that was unnaturally calm. The subsequent punishment of Solomon was not a private act of retribution, but a public spectacle, a brutal and exemplary punishment in the barn for all the other slaves to see. Hawthorne's analysis of this event is sharp and insightful. He writes, "He punished the man not for the sin, but for its visibility. The act itself was secondary to the fact that it had been witnessed. The honor of the house had been stained, and in his mind only the public performance of discipline could cleanse the record." This social fracture was not about morality. It was about the catastrophic failure of the family's facade. Elias Beaumont was not a husband betrayed, but a king whose subjects had seen a flaw in the crown. This incident sends shock waves through the small, insular world of the plantation. The other enslaved people who had long observed Solomon's strange, privileged position now saw him subjected to the same brutal logic that governed their own lives. Yet Hawthorne notes a new element in their demeanor, a quiet, watchful fear, not of the master, but of Solomon himself. They seem to understand on an intuitive level that this was not a simple transgression and punishment, but the opening move in a dangerous and intricate game. For Eliza, the exposure is a profound humiliation. She is forced to witness the punishment, a silent participant in the brutal undoing of her private world of control. Hawthorne describes her as pale and shaken, her usual imperious confidence replaced by a new, unfamiliar fear. She had believed her power to be absolute, but she now understood that it existed only within the secret confines of the house. By engineering a moment of public discovery, Solomon had turned her own weapon, intimate control, against her, exposing her to the judgment of her husband and her society. The social fabric of the plantation begins to tear. Whispers and rumors, once confined to the slave quarters, now find their way into the conversations of neighboring families. The perfect image of the Beaumonts begins to crack, revealing the discord and dysfunction beneath. The family's honor, once their greatest asset, now becomes their greatest vulnerability. They are forced to retreat deeper into their isolation, their public appearances becoming more strained and less frequent. Their unity revealed as a fragile illusion. Solomon, for his part, bears the punishment with the same unnatural stillness he has always displayed. Hawthorne, who witnesses the aftermath, writes that there was no trace of fear or hatred in his eyes, only a cold, terrifying resolve. The physical pain seemed irrelevant, a calculated cost in a much larger war. He had successfully weaponized the truth, using the rigid honor code of his oppressors to turn them against one another. He had exposed the rot, and now he would simply wait for the structure to collapse under its own weight. The record of this first social fracture marks a critical turning point. Solomon has transformed from a passive object of abuse into an active agent of retribution. His revenge is not aimed at the body, but at the very concept of honor and reputation that gives his masters their power. He has understood that the only way to destroy a family like the Beaumonts is not to attack them from the outside, but to force them to devour themselves from within. The foundation of the house was now cracked, and the entire sinister edifice was beginning to tilt. The initial social fracture soon deepened into an irreparable chasm driven by a second, more damning moment of exposure, this time the irrefutable. Evidence is not recorded solely in Reverend Hawthorne's private diary, but is corroborated by a new source, a fragment of a letter written by a neighboring plantation owner to his brother in South Carolina. This document, recovered from a university archive almost a century later, provides a chillingly detached third-party account of the Beaumont family's public downfall, confirming the systemic nature of the horror that Solomon had unleashed. The incident, as pieced together from both sources, occurred during a small social gathering at the Beaumont Manor. In the middle of the evening, a house servant, presumably acting on Solomon's instruction, discreetly informed Elias Beaumont that his wife had retired to her bedroom with a severe headache. Later, the same servant, with a feigned look of alarm, alerted him again, this time suggesting that something was amiss. In front of his guests, Elias was forced to ascend the grand staircase and confront the locked door of his own wife's chambers. The neighbor's letter describes the scene that followed with cold observational detail. After his demands to open the door were met with silence, Elias Beaumont, his face a mask of pale fury, broke it down. The letter writer, standing at the bottom of the staircase, could not see into the room, but he describes what he saw in Elias Beaumont's face. He stood on the landing as if turned to stone, his hand still on the shattered doorframe. The entire illusion of his life, his honor, his name was undone in that moment for all to see. Inside the room, though the details are not specified, was Solomon. Reverend Hawthorne's corresponding diary entry is not a record of the event itself, but of its immediate silent aftermath. He describes the abrupt and awkward departure of the guests, the stifling quiet that descended upon the house, and the look of utter devastation on Elias Beaumont's face. He writes, "A profound silence fell over the plantation, a silence that was not peaceful, but was the sound of a family soul leaving its body. The performance was over. The stage was in ruins. All that remained were the actors trapped in the wreckage of the lie they had built." The documented impact of this irrefutable evidence was catastrophic and total. The whispers and rumors that had followed the first incident now hardened into a grim, unspoken certainty within the community. The Beaumont family was no longer just troubled. They were disgraced. In the honor-bound society of antebellum Georgia, such a public humiliation was a form of social death, a stain that could never be washed away. Their name, once a symbol of power and respectability, was now synonymous with scandal and moral failure. This event reinforces Solomon's strategy as one of terrifying intellectual brilliance. He had not used a weapon of iron or fire, but had instead wielded the truth with surgical precision. He understood that in this world, the appearance of sin was more damning than the sin itself. By forcing Elias Beaumont to be the one to break down the door, he made him the agent of his own dishonor, the public author of his family's ruin. It was a checkmate in a game that his masters never even knew they were playing. The psychological impact on the Beaumont family was absolute. Elias retreated into a solitary alcohol-fueled despair, his authority on the plantation dissolving overnight. Eliza was effectively imprisoned in her rooms, not by her husband's command, but by the sheer weight of her own shame. The house, once a symbol of their dominance, now became their shared prison, a place of silent accusations and unbearable tension. The carefully maintained facade had been utterly and irrevocably destroyed. For Reverend Hawthorne, this moment is one of profound moral crisis. He sees the hand of a terrible righteous justice at work, yet he is horrified by its devastating consequences. He recognizes the genius of Solomon's revenge, but he also sees the collateral damage, the complete implosion of a family, however corrupt. His faith offers him no comfort, no easy answers. He is simply a witness to a perfect and terrifying equation of sin and retribution. The irrefutable evidence had done its work. The family's power, built on a foundation of public perception, was gone. All that was left was the raw, festering reality of their own dysfunction. The silence that filled the great house was the sound of a vacuum, a space waiting to be filled by the final violent act of this terrifying family tragedy. The question was no longer if the house would fall, but who would be buried in the rubble. In the weeks following the public disgrace, the formal structures of power at Willowbrook Plantation began to collapse entirely. The authority of Elias Beaumont, once absolute, evaporated into a haze of whiskey and self-pity. Reverend Hawthorne's diary from this period describes him as a ghost in his own house, a man hollowed out by the public destruction of his honor. He no longer managed the plantation's affairs or administered discipline. He simply drifted through the rooms, his presence a constant spectral reminder of his family's ruin. Eliza Beaumont, the catalyst for the disaster, became a prisoner in the gilded cage she had once commanded. Confined to her chambers, she was stripped of her authority over the household and her role as a social leader. Hawthorne records catching only fleeting glimpses of her celebrated beauty now faded and replaced by a haunted, fearful expression. She was no longer the cruel priestess of a private cult. She was simply a disgraced woman trapped in a house that had become a monument to her transgressions. Into this profound power vacuum stepped the one figure whose authority was not based on social standing or ownership, but on the unshakable certainty of her own righteousness, Lydia Beaumont. With her brother incapacitated and her sister-in-law in seclusion, Lydia seized control of the household's moral and spiritual life. The once quiet, resentful observer now became an avenging angel, her austere piety transforming into a militant, almost fanatical zeal. The nature of her authority is documented in a series of increasingly alarmed entries from Reverend Hawthorne. He writes that Lydia began to hold nightly prayer meetings in the grand parlor, gatherings to which the house slaves were compelled to attend. Her sermons were not messages of forgiveness or grace, but fire and brimstone condemnations of the sin that had infected their house. She spoke of purging fire, of divine judgment, and of the need for a great and terrible cleansing to restore the family's name in the eyes of God. Hawthorne's records of these sermons are deeply disturbing. He notes that her prayers seemed directed not toward salvation, but toward a verdict. She did not pray for the redemption of her family, but for the swift and righteous punishment of the guilty. Her gaze during these sermons would often fixate on the shadows at the back of the room where Solomon stood, silent and observant as ever. She is not praying against the sin, Hawthorne writes, but against the sinner. And in her mind, the sinner is not her sister, but the instrument that revealed the sin. This collapse of traditional authority and the rise of Lydia's fanatical rule created a tense, volatile atmosphere on the plantation. The disciplined order of the past was replaced by a sense of impending doom, a feeling that the house was building toward a final violent catharsis. Lydia had become the self-appointed inquisitor of her family's moral failings, and her relentless calls for judgment seemed to be invoking the very disaster she claimed to be trying to prevent. Solomon, the architect of this chaos, remained an enigma. He continued to perform his duties with silent efficiency, now serving a new, zealous mistress. He stood through Lydia's tirades with the same unnerving stillness, his expression unreadable. It was as if he had set the final pieces of the puzzle in place and was now content to watch as the inevitable picture emerged. He had created the conditions for the family's self-destruction, and now Lydia's religious fervor was providing the fuel for the coming fire. The Reverend, watching this new dynamic unfold, felt a growing sense of terror. He saw in Lydia's eyes a dangerous light, a righteous certainty that bordered on madness. She believed she was an agent of God's will, a warrior fighting a holy war against the forces of darkness that had invaded her home. But Hawthorne suspected she was merely another unwitting pawn in Solomon's long and patient game. Her righteous fury, the final ingredient needed to bring about the plantation's total annihilation. The authority of the master was gone, replaced by the authority of the zealot. The house was no longer governed by the rules of society, but by the crazed logic of a holy crusade. The collapse was nearly complete. All that was needed was a spark to ignite the fumes of hatred, resentment, and religious mania that now filled the once grand halls of the Beaumont Manor. The final judgment was coming not from the heavens, but from within the corrupted heart of the house itself. For over a century, the narrative of the Beaumont family's collapse was understood primarily through the tormented lens of Reverend Hawthorne's diary. It presented a clear if horrifying picture, a decadent family, a psychologically brilliant slave, and a spiral into chaos. But the discovery of a hidden source, a secret letter unearthed from a dusty chest in a South Carolina historical society, profoundly altered this understanding. The document reveals that the destruction of Willowbrook was not solely the work of an outside agent of revenge, but was actively aided by the treachery festering within the family itself. The source is a letter written by Lydia Beaumont to a distant cousin dated just 2 weeks before the final tragedy. Its tone is a chilling mixture of pious justification and cold, premeditated malice. In it, she confesses her lifelong resentment of her sister-in-law Eliza, describing her not as a beloved family member, but as a Jezebel whose vanity and worldliness were a constant offense to God. The letter exposes the true nature of her austere religiosity. It was not a product of genuine faith, but a weaponized form of envy. The most damning section of the letter addresses the scandal that had engulfed the family. Lydia does not express shame or sorrow. Instead, she frames the public disgrace as an act of divine providence, a necessary and welcome intervention from a righteous God. She writes, "The Lord in his infinite wisdom has finally revealed the serpent that has long resided in our garden. The enslaved man, Solomon, is but the instrument of a much-needed scourging, a vessel for a judgment that is both terrible and just. I pray nightly for the Almighty to finish his holy work." This passage irrefutably recasts Lydia's role in the drama. She was not a passive observer who simply stepped into a power vacuum, nor was she a well-intentioned zealot driven mad by events. She was a conscious and willing co-conspirator in the family's destruction. Her fervent calls for cleansing fire were not just metaphorical. They were a literal prayer for annihilation, a desire to see the entire corrupt structure burned to the ground so that something new, and presumably under her own control, could be built in its place. The discovery of this hidden source deepens the moral complexity of the story. Solomon is no longer a lone avenger, a singular force of retribution acting upon a dysfunctional but united family. Instead, he's revealed as a masterful catalyst, an agent who simply exposed the deep pre-existing fissures of hatred and jealousy, allowing the family's own internal poisons to complete the work of destruction. He did not need to be the sole author of their ruin. He merely had to give the characters permission to play out their darkest impulses. This changes the interpretation of the events leading up to the final night. Lydia's increasingly fanatical behavior was not a reaction to chaos, but a deliberate effort to escalate it. Her fiery sermons were not just prayers. They were incitements, attempts to create a psychological atmosphere where a violent conclusion would feel not just possible, but divinely ordained. She was sanctifying the coming disaster, providing a holy pretext for the profane events that would follow. The letter also adds a new layer of tragedy to the story of Elias and Eliza Beaumont. They were not just the victims of an outsider's revenge, but were also betrayed from within by a family member who cloaked her own bitter resentments in the language of faith. Their prison was not just the house itself, but the web of deceit and hatred woven by someone they had trusted, someone who slept under their own roof while praying for their downfall. This revelation serves as a critical turning point in the historical understanding of the case. The horror of Willowbrook was not the result of a single monstrous act, but of a perfect storm of human failings. Pride, lust, cruelty, envy, and a sanctimonious hypocrisy that provided the ultimate justification for evil. Solomon may have lit the match, but the house was already soaked in gasoline poured by the hands of those who lived within it. With this new understanding, the final act of the tragedy appears even more inevitable. The forces of destruction were now aligned both from without and from within. Solomon, the agent of exposure, and Lydia, the agent of holy incitement, were working, whether consciously or not, toward the same terrible end. The house was primed for its final violent purification. The only remaining question was the exact form that the Lord's work would take. The entry begins late in the evening. Hawthorne writes of an unnatural quiet that had fallen over the entire plantation, a heavy, expectant silence that seemed to press down on the land. This was broken shortly after midnight by the sound of a single gunshot, its sharp report echoing across the fields. He notes that it did not sound like a hunting rifle, but like a smaller pistol, the kind a gentleman might keep in his desk drawer. The sound was not followed by a second shot, but by a different, more brutal noise, the splintering of heavy wood, as if a large piece of furniture had been thrown against a wall. Then came the screams. Hawthorne takes great care to describe their character, noting that they were not the short, sharp cries of sudden pain. They were prolonged, terrifying wails that he identifies as belonging to Eliza Beaumont. He writes, "It was not a scream of physical agony, but of a profound and soul-shattering recognition. It was the sound of a person seeing a truth so awful, so absolute, that it annihilated their very being." She was not screaming at an attacker, but at a revelation. These screams, he records, went on for what felt like an eternity before being abruptly cut off. It is at this point in his diary that Hawthorne details his own decision-making process. He confesses to the impulse to run toward the manor to offer aid to fulfill his duty as a minister and a citizen. But he was held back by a paralyzing fear, a conviction that what was happening in the Beaumont house was not a simple crime of man. He saw it as the culmination of all the spiritual decay he had witnessed, the final violent payment of a long overdue moral debt. His justification is stark and steeped in the fatalistic theology of the Old Testament. He writes, "This was not a matter for the sheriff or for a humble servant of the New Covenant. This was an Old Testament judgment, a cleansing of a house that had become an abomination. What right had I to interfere? I am not Abraham to question the will of such a terrible and righteous God. I could do nothing but bear witness to the verdict." He locked his door, shuttered his windows, and spent the rest of the night on his knees in prayer, listening to the horrifying sounds from the great house. After the screaming stopped, a new sound began, a low rhythmic cracking and popping, which he soon identified as the sound of fire. He saw a faint orange glow begin to illuminate the sky above the manor. It was not a wild, consuming blaze, but a slow, seemingly controlled fire, as if it were burning from the inside out, consuming the heart of the house first. The smell of smoke, thick and acrid, soon filled the air. A funeral pyre for a family that had already been spiritually dead for months. The decision to document rather than to act would haunt Reverend Hawthorne for the rest of his life. His justification, while born of genuine terror and a skewed sense of religious awe, was also an admission of his own powerlessness. He had seen the sickness, diagnosed the disease, and even predicted the outcome. But in the final critical moment, he could only retreat into the role of a passive observer, a scribe recording the final chapter of a story he was too afraid to be a part of. His diary entry for that night is the only surviving record of the sounds and sequence of the tragedy. It is a document born of fear and a terrible conflicted faith. It presents the final actions not as a chaotic explosion of violence, but as a methodical, almost ritualistic process of destruction. The gunshot, the breaking furniture, the revelatory screams, and the final cleansing fire. Each element feels like a planned step in a horrifying ceremony of retribution. By morning, silence had returned. The orange glow had faded, replaced by a plume of dark smoke rising into the pale dawn sky. The judgment, as Hawthorne had framed it, was over. His final lines for that night are a testament to his shattered faith and his certainty that a line had been crossed from which there was no return. "The Lord's work is done," he wrote, his handwriting shaky and barely legible, "and I fear his face is a terrible thing to behold." The full horror of what occurred on the night of November 15th is revealed not through the emotional, terrified prose of Reverend Hawthorne, but through the cold procedural language of the final primary source, the official report of the Madison County Deputy Sheriff, who was the first to enter the smoke-filled ruins of the Beaumont Manor. This document, read in a detached, bureaucratic tone, provides a clinical and stark interpretation of the scene. Its dispassionate detailing of the facts making the implications all the more macabre and disturbing. The report begins with a description of the house itself. The fire had not consumed the entire structure, but had gutted the central core, the grand staircase, the parlor, and the master bedroom suite. The damage is described as severe but localized, suggesting the fire was not accidental. The deputy notes the pervasive smell of smoke and something akin to burnt meat. The once grand home had been transformed into a charnel house, a tomb for the family that had built it. The first body discovered was that of Elias Beaumont. He was found at the bottom of the grand staircase amidst the shattered remains of a large ornate grandfather clock. The cause of death is listed as a broken neck, consistent with a fall from a great height. The report notes without comment that a single-shot pistol recently fired was found near his hand, though there were no gunshot wounds on his body. The scene suggested a struggle, a final futile attempt by the patriarch to reclaim his lost authority. The true horror, however, awaited in the master bedroom. The room was largely untouched by the fire, but was in a state of utter disarray. Furniture was overturned, and expensive fabrics were torn to shreds. Here the deputy found Eliza and Lydia Beaumont. They were alive but unresponsive, huddled together in a corner. The report describes them as being in a catatonic state, their eyes open but vacant, without any sign of recognition. It is here that the document contains its most chilling and carefully worded phrase, stating that both women bore diverse evidences of irreparable intimate abuses. The deputy's report then records the most unsettling discovery of all. The two Beaumont children, sons aged 7 and 9, were not in their beds. Their rooms were undisturbed, showing no signs of struggle or fire. They were simply gone. A thorough search of the house and the immediate grounds revealed no trace of them. This is recorded as a simple, factual statement. The two male heirs of the estate, Thomas and William Beaumont, are missing, and their whereabouts are unknown. Finally, the report addresses the man at the center of the entire affair. It states with bureaucratic finality, the enslaved man, known as Solomon, property of the Beaumont estate, is absent and unaccounted for. A search of his quarters in the main house revealed nothing of his possessions or his person. He had vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of almost biblical devastation. His name appears only once in the official record of the crime, not as a suspect, but as a missing asset. The interpretation of this final source is one of brutal symbolic justice. Each member of the family received a fate that was a grotesque reflection of their own sins. Elias Beaumont, obsessed with his public standing, died in a public fall from grace at the center of his own house. Eliza and Lydia, who had wielded intimacy and piety as weapons of control and jealousy, were left in a state of living death, their bodies the final testament to the perverse power dynamics they had fostered. The report, in its refusal to speculate, becomes the most powerful indictment of all. It does not attempt to explain the how or the why. It simply presents the results: a dead patriarch, 2 broken women, 2 vanished children, and 1 missing slave. The cold facts are left to speak for themselves, and they tell a story of revenge so total and so perfectly tailored to its victims that it feels less like a human act and more like the execution of a supernatural sentence. The official investigation into the Beaumont tragedy was brief and inconclusive. With the primary witnesses dead or insane, and the only person of interest having disappeared without a trace, the case was quietly closed. The horror at Willowbrook was too complex, too disturbing for the simple legal frameworks of the time to process. The community and the official record chose the path of least resistance, to forget. But the deputy's report remains a permanent, clinical record of a night when a family's sins were paid for in the most terrible currency imaginable. The documented consequences of the night of horror at Willowbrook Plantation trace a story of deliberate erasure and the slow decay of memory. The legacy of the Beaumont family was not one of enduring wealth or influence, but of a swift and total disappearance from the historical record. A testament to a scandal so profound that society chose to excise it like a cancerous tumor. The official documents that follow the tragedy are notable for their brevity and their finality, each one a nail in the coffin of the Beaumont name. The first consequences recorded in a set of medical and legal papers from a private asylum in Tennessee. These documents confirm that Eliza and Lydia Beaumont were quietly transported out of Georgia just weeks after the incident. They were admitted under a different surname, their true identities concealed to avoid further scandal. Medical notes described their condition as a permanent state of melancholic hysteria, noting that neither woman ever spoke another coherent word. They lived out the remainder of their lives in the asylum. silent ghosts haunting its secluded gardens, their minds forever trapped in the ruins of their final night. The great Willowbrook Plantation, once a jewel of Madison County, was sold at a public auction to settle the estate's debts. A bill of sale shows it was purchased by a consortium of northern investors who had no interest in its history. The land was divided, the grand manor was torn down, and the name Willowbrook was deliberately changed, scrubbed from local maps, as if it had never existed. The physical heart of the Beaumont dynasty was dismantled, its foundations plowed over, and no visible scar on the landscape. Reverend Elias Hawthorne's legacy is found in the archives of his diocese. A formal letter dated December 1858 contains his desperate request for a transfer. He cites a crisis of the soul and a need to serve God in a place less burdened by the complexities of man's world. His request was granted, and he was reassigned to a remote, struggling parish in the raw territories of the West. His detailed, horrified diary of the Beaumont affair was packed away with his belongings, a private testament to a story he would never publicly speak of again. He too disappeared from the history of Georgia, but the most significant legacy is found in a single brutal alteration to a plantation inventory ledger from 1859. In the list of human property belonging to the now defunct Beaumont estate, Solomon's name is listed. However, a thick, angry line of black ink has been drawn through it, the pen having been pressed so hard it tore the paper. The name is almost completely obscured, an act of violent bureaucratic erasure. In the margin, scrawled in a different, cruder hand, is a single definitive word: gone. This act of scratching out his name is powerfully symbolic. In a system that defined a person's entire existence by their entry in a ledger, this erasure was a second death, a deliberate attempt to deny that he had ever existed at all. Yet paradoxically, the violence of the act itself becomes a monument. The torn paper and the single word gone are more powerful than any formal record, a testament to a man who broke the system so completely that the system's only recourse was to pretend he was never there. The fate of the Beaumont children remains the most tragic and enduring part of the legacy. Their disappearance was never solved. No bodies were ever found. They simply vanished from their beds, innocent casualties of their parents' sins. In the local folklore that survived, whispered for generations after the official story was buried, some said they were taken by Solomon as the final act of his revenge. Others told a darker, more terrifying tale that the house itself, in its final agonizing moments, had consumed them as a sacrifice. The consequences, therefore, were not of justice and resolution, but of silence, erasure, and a permanent haunting void. The guilty were neutralized, the witnesses were scattered, and the innocent were lost forever. All that remained was a story that was too horrific to be told, and a single mutilated entry in a ledger that spoke of a man who had achieved the ultimate freedom. Not just freedom from bondage, but freedom from history itself. The legacy of the Beaumont massacre is ultimately one of absence, an absence of records, an absence of graves, an absence of answers. It is a story defined by what is missing, a black hole in the historical narrative of Madison County, a silent testament to a crime so perfectly executed that it successfully erased itself, leaving behind only the faintest and most disturbing of ghosts. The final analysis of the Beaumont case reveals a story that transcends a simple narrative of slave revenge. It is a meticulous deconstruction of a corrupt social order executed by a man who understood the intricate machinery of his oppressors better than they understood it themselves. Solomon's revenge was not just on a single family, but on the very concept of honor, piety, and history upon which the slaveholding South was built. He did not simply burn down a house. He systematically dismantled a system of lies by exposing its rotten foundations. The fragmentary nature of the evidence, a diary, a letter, a clinical report, forces any historical interpretation to be an act of reconstruction. Yet the picture that emerges is one of terrifying coherence. Solomon's strategy was psychological, not physical. He recognized that the Beaumonts' greatest strength, their public reputation, was also their greatest weakness. By turning their own codes of conduct against them, he forced them into a state of social and moral collapse, becoming the authors of their own destruction long before the final night of violence. His own erasure from the record was perhaps his final most brilliant act. In a world where an enslaved person's existence was validated only by their inclusion in a master's inventory, Solomon achieved a unique form of liberation by orchestrating a horror so complete that the system could not process it. He forced his own nullification. To be gone from the ledger was to be free from the narrative of ownership. He became a legend, a folk tale, a whisper, a force of nature that passed through and vanished, unburdened by a history that sought only to define him as property. A final unsettling piece of evidence adds a layer of supernatural realism to this historical analysis. A modern agronomy report commissioned in the late 20th century for a proposed development on the old Beaumont lands contains a curious footnote. It notes a specific circular patch of ground roughly corresponding to the location of the old manor house where the soil remains inexplicably barren. Multiple attempts at cultivation have failed. The land there is sterile, incapable of supporting life. This physical scar on the earth serves as a permanent silent monument to a sin so profound it poisoned the very ground it was built upon. This leads to the ultimate unanswerable question of the Beaumont tragedy. The fate of the two children. Their disappearance is the story's true moral void, a question that resists any satisfying historical or logical explanation. If Solomon took them, was it an act of mercy, rescuing them from the toxic legacy of their family? Or was it the final cruelest turn of the screw in his revenge? If they perished in the house, why were their bodies never found among the ashes? The most chilling hypothesis, born from the folklore that endured long after the facts were forgotten, is the one that posits a darker, more elemental justice. This theory suggests that Solomon was merely a catalyst, an agent who unlocked a malevolent energy that already existed within the house, an energy born of the family's own cruelty and hypocrisy. In this interpretation, the house itself, in a final act of self-immolation, claimed the innocent heirs as a blood sacrifice, a final payment for the sins of the parents. This leaves us with a terrifying open question. Was the crime at Willowbrook Plantation the work of a man or the work of a place? The story of the Beaumont family and the macabre revenge of the man known as Solomon is in the end a testament to the enduring power of buried truths. It demonstrates that history is not just a record of events but a living force, and that the sins of the past have a way of demanding a reckoning, often in a form that is both perfectly just and incomprehensibly horrific. What truly happened to the Beaumont children remains the final silent seal on a story that history tried and failed to completely forget. The darkest chapters of history are written in ink and blood, but the most terrifying stories are those that are silently erased. As the embers of Willowbrook fade into legend, remember, some shadows never lift. They've clawed at your mind tonight. Don't let them go alone. Hit that subscribe for more unearthings from Hollow Truths, turn on notifications, and share this whisper in the dark. What forgotten sin haunts your backyard? Drop it in the comments. Until next time, tread lightly. The ground still remembers,